I'm Alex Hall, and this is Disorder, the podcast where we try to make sense of our mad world. And in today's episode, we're going to take a first look at China, which has rapidly developed to become the world's second largest economy, with the world's largest military and second largest defense budget after the United States. Under its current leader, President Xi Jinping, China has an explicit ambition to make its military a world-class force by 2027. This is all stoking fears that Beijing seeks to supplant the US as the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific and eventually the rest of the globe. In recent testimony to the US Armed Services House Committee, the outgoing head of the US Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral John Aquilino, said that China's military is actually building up at a rate not seen since World War II, putting it on track to meet its goal of being ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. Aquilino added that of the three main US concerns in the region, Russia, China, and North Korea, China is the only country that has the capability, capacity, and crucially the intent to upend the international order. So in this episode, we're going to delve more deeply into the rationale behind China's massive military buildup and how seriously we should take Xi's stated ambition of assimilating Taiwan into China by force if necessary. What challenges would such an invasion present for China? And what can Taiwan and its friends do to prepare and ideally deter such a likelihood? To that end, I'm delighted to be joined by China and Taiwan expert and former Danish diplomat Jonas Parello-Plesner, whose book, The Battle for Taiwan, has recently been made available in English on Amazon. Jonas is executive director of the Alliance of Democracies Foundation and has also worked as a senior China fellow for international think tanks in Washington, Brussels, and London. But we began our interview by discussing what China's reaction to the recent earthquake in Taiwan revealed about its intentions towards its island neighbor.
Taiwan is a quite peculiar and quite isolated democracy, with the fact that you have the People's Republic of China that claim to represent Taiwan, and that Taiwan has always been an unalienable part of China. And you have the Taiwanese that, of course, function with a free system, have free elections, and there's a real kind of curtain down through the Taiwan Strait between a very autocratic system on the one side in the People's Republic of China and a very free and democratic system in Taiwan.
Just for the benefit of our listeners, not all of whom will be as familiar with Taiwan as perhaps countries closer to home, can you just sort of give us sort of a very quick snapshot of why Taiwan is fighting so hard for its independence? How did Taiwan achieve independence? Why does China think it still has a claim on it?
In short, it boils down to the Chinese Civil War after the Second World War. And when the People's Republic of China was proclaimed in 1949 by Mao, he fought against Chiang Kai-shek. He was the leader of the nationalists, and they fled to Taiwan that had before that been a Japanese province, actually, for almost 7 decades. And then established and continued the Republic of China out there. So basically, Mao and Chiang Kai-shek agreed there's just one China. We just disagree about who won the war. And Chiang Kai-shek led a pretty authoritarian system in Taiwan, so he was nothing to brag about when you like freedom and democracy. Then what happened was, after his son took over, and then gradually Taiwan moved towards free elections and freedom of expression. And through that process of democratization, that became Taiwanization as well, that the Taiwanese more and more said we're actually something different. And of course, on the other side, it's also a lot of propaganda in the sense that it's part of the People's Republic of China's founding sort of mission that they should reunite the full motherland. And whenever Taiwan is part of that, and also the South China Sea, as they lay claim to, then that historic mission is kind of achieved. And that comes way on top of any consideration of local autonomy and democracy.
Would it be fair to say that the Chinese sort of regard Taiwanese independence as a kind of an affront, and they feel they have this rightful claim to Taiwan, rather similar to the way that Putin is sort of insulted by Ukraine's temerity to resist the reunification of Ukraine as part of Greater Russia? Is there that kind of sort of imperial condescension and arrogance that is also behind the Chinese approach?
There is, and I do think it's similar. Of course, there's a lot of that history that's also very different, but there is that same element of a sort of dictator, be it Putin or be it Xi Jinping, that has a certain vision of history, has a certain vision of himself in that history, and nothing else really matters. So in that sense, that's also why the Taiwanese got so startled when they saw the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, because they were like, this could be us. Some of the interviews I do, and which are the ones I found most personally relatable and touching, were with Taiwanese that immediately went to Ukraine to fight against the Russians and for Ukrainian freedom.
There are Taiwanese fighting in Ukraine?
There are. Yeah, one of them that I interviewed, Tony, he had never been to Europe. He didn't speak a word of English or very little, and of course no Ukrainian. And he still made it in through Poland, joined the Foreign Legion and served in. And when I asked him, how does all this work out for you without the proper language and everything? He said very sweetly, I found, like, well, when you come and show solidarity and compassion, you don't need a language. And the Ukrainians knew I was there to help. And another that I interviewed, Jack, was very clear when I said, why did you go? He said, if we don't stop Putin and Putin's Russia in Ukraine, we will be next, because that will be a sign to a dictator like Xi Jinping. This is a world now where you can take your small neighboring countries without any repercussions from the international society.
One of the theories that certainly in my circle of foreign policy analysts we've often believed is that Putin sees Ukraine's democracy as a threat to his own form of government. So one of the reasons that Putin has been so hostile to democracy developing in Ukraine or Georgia, where I was posted, is it counters the myth that democracy is only some kind of Western European construct and it can't exist in the East, and it undermines the premise of his own government. Does that same philosophy also apply in the China-Taiwan context? I mean, Taiwan is now a very successful, liberal, vibrant democracy. Does that threaten the Chinese authoritarian model as well?
I think it does. And I think it does play into Xi Jinping's even greater desire than his predecessors to sort of what he calls reunite, but basically potentially also forcefully integrate Taiwan into China. And we see it with Hong Kong, because basically Hong Kong was the model that was supposed to be the template for Taiwan, one country, two systems. That's what was also promised the British when the British left and the basic law was created, was that like Hong Kong would maintain its own system, move more gradually towards democracy. What has happened very abruptly since 2019, but also started in the years before, was basically that Hong Kong's liberties have been completely curtailed. And the Taiwanese have seen it. It played a big role in the Taiwanese presidential elections in 2020, that they had seen Hong Kong, basically the light turned off, saying, if this is the model that the Chinese are offering us, we don't really see even the most China positive in Taiwan. We don't really see that model where we maintain our independent system and still have a confederation of sorts. Another, again, personal example, where I talked to Li Ming-che. He's a Taiwanese democracy activist, you could say. So he's gone into China and basically, very matter of fact, just to tell about how the Taiwanese system works with free elections for president and so on. And he got jailed in China and served time there. And his crime was basically trying just to explain Chinese about this is what's happening in Taiwan. So that shows sort of the level of allergy that the Chinese Communist Party and the ruling system has against what Taiwan kind of represents.
What you're saying reflects a certain naivety, a well-intentioned naivety, but naivety nevertheless on the part of the West and the British over Hong Kong, that somehow these two systems could reconcile. Because, you know, every year for years, the people of Hong Kong would commemorate the awful Tiananmen Square events, and China just couldn't really allow that to happen, because having Hong Kong be this sort of vibrant, freer society would mean that issues would end up being discussed there that would filter back into China. So I suspect we were guilty of a certain naivety, right?
No, definitely. But it also showed with new leadership, because you could say under the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao era, Hong Kong was left to a much larger degree alone, and with where you had newspapers like the South China Morning Post, Apple Daily, functioning like sort of relatively beacons of press freedom and so on. So it was also really a will decision during here the Xi Jinping regime of saying, no, it's more important to curtail for these 6 million and that these couple of million young democracy activists that want to see a different Hong Kong, that they don't get it their way. And we are willing to use our energy to crush them, basically. So yes, we were naive, but it was also a change in leadership and approach. I mean, with Xi Jinping, when he came into power shortly afterwards, we had this leaked document number 9 that basically showed him saying to the party, these ideas of freedom of expression, democracy, and so on, they're all Western, they're not ours. And it's not just that we don't want them at home, we actually actively want to sort of curb them internationally as well. So that was a big change. And you see this now with, I think for all of us, with the Ukraine war, the way February was such an important month, 2022. But one meeting I think was maybe equally important was when in the beginning of the month, you had Putin and Xi Jinping meeting and signing this strategic document, basically outlining this autocratic manifesto saying we're really displeased about how the way the world works with the US as a sort of anchor of the rules-based international order, and we want something different. But yeah, we were quite naive about at the same time that we're building the world's second largest army, and they're the only one with capability, intent, and so on that can rival the Americans, and will, of course, have their own vision of how they want to see the world evolve towards 2049, which is in a much more Chinese-friendly and Chinese-directed and Chinese-controlled version of the world.
But you started that comment by noting that things began to shift when Xi came to power, and that actually at the time of the handover of Hong Kong, it wasn't an unreasonable hope that this arrangement would work, and that it was really under Xi that the strategy and the posture began to shift. So can I ask you to go a little bit more into Xi himself, because he's now such the dominant figure in China and he's eliminated many of his rivals. Why do you think he has so much more of an aggressive, ambitious stance than his predecessors? Is it the way the world has changed, or is it something about his own personality, do you think?
I've come to revise some of my assumptions, so I could also maybe be wrong now, but I do think people, particularly at the top, and particularly dictators, matter more than we think. So I think the fact that Xi really wanted to consolidate power, he abolished all the sort of the restrictions there were in the Communist Party on how long you can rule. So he's basically like, Putin has a different version where he still gets these sham elections. Xi doesn't even need those. He needs a sort of anointment in the party now. But apart from that, there are basically no reins on his power. So in that sense, you could say Xi is the most powerful man in China since Mao. But he's also, of course, a guy who sits looking around his shoulder like Putin does when is somebody trying to challenge me. And that's why we've seen, even though he got all his yes men into position, he's also inherently paranoid about who is going to challenge internally his rule, particularly now when the Chinese economy is not at all doing as well as it used to do, and that breaks the traditional contract that was between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party, saying you keep quiet and we keep growing. Thereby you'll get new cars, new apartments, and new refrigerators, and it's all going great. And that's not happening really any longer, and therefore, unfortunately, also makes that nationalism, like for Putin, can be one of the levers and one of the things that Xi can turn to.
Right. So when you're not sure about your internal situation, you play up external threats.
Exactly. And then that's why I think Taiwan becomes an even bigger thing for Xi Jinping. I mean, there is the conversation between Mao and Kissinger where they're talking about Taiwan. And then he says, well, we have 100 years to solve that. And this is in the early 70s. So that would mean we would have till 2073. And I think Xi Jinping is way more impatient in that sense than Mao, and says this is a question, the Taiwan question, that cannot be passed down from generation to generation, but it has to be solved at least within the time span that Xi is leading. So, I mean, in that sense, unfortunately, I fear that, like Putin with Ukraine, something is brewing that within the period that Xi Jinping is at power. I mean, if you can do this with peaceful means, that will be definitely the Chinese preferred method. But I see no Taiwanese leader willing to run elections on unifying with China. So it's probably and very unlikely going to happen through the political system, even though the Chinese try disinformation, they try to sort of corrupt politicians and in many ways influence Taiwanese society. Fundamentally, the Taiwanese have overall sort of chosen they want to live in their own free society.
Can you set out the other ways in which China is putting pressure on Taiwan? So there is this massive military build-up, but that's not the only way that China tries to isolate Taiwan. Can you explain a few of the other ways in which they're trying to undermine or put pressure on Taiwan?
Sure. I mean, first of all, it's political. The fact that Taiwan is not a UN member and China has a seat, they stand up now with the earthquake and say, we represent in the United Nations Taiwan and thanks on behalf of the Taiwanese people, even though, of course, the Taiwanese political system is not represented in that at all. So that's one, and they, of course, use that. And Taiwan, as the Republic of China, has a few diplomatic allies left, meaning countries that recognize the Republic of China and have diplomatic relations with them. They're now down to 12, and mostly microstates out in the Pacific that recognize Taiwan and China. So that's the political isolation of basically saying, you have no friends. Then they try at each Taiwanese election to meddle in them in different ways. So that's in social media interference. When I was in Taiwan for the election in January, they had already adopted new techniques with AI, deep fakes, and had sort of a fake. So then you would have people reading aloud these sort of different sort of stories that would be slander stories about the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, or about the Democratic Progressive Party's candidate, Lai Ching-te, that won. But fundamentally, it's not really working for China. I mean, their least preferred candidate still won the presidential election. Then they use economic coercion as well as another tool that they are both extremely interlinked, and so is Taiwan, with the Chinese market. But then they take selected products and ban them from the Chinese market on the sort of spurious reasons and say, oh, pineapples from Taiwan are no longer safe. So we are like stopping. And then they know that a lot of pineapple farmers vote for the more independent-seeking party, the Democratic Progressive Party. The other part is reinforcing that political message of you're isolated. There's nobody else here to save you. Not even the Americans will save you. Which is part of actually the disinformation when you look at the elections that they push to a lot, which is already there, so it's not completely created by the Chinese, but as a sort of growing skepticism in the Taiwanese population about, is the US really there to defend us? Because they have experience, of course, also historically when the US moved its diplomatic recognition from Republic of China, Taiwan, over to the People's Republic at the end of the 70s. So they've seen Hong Kong being abandoned, and that's one of the tropes that the Chinese and disinformation really like to push at. Whenever there's such a story showing, oh, no, the Americans will really leave you hanging there and don't believe them at all and just sort of rejoin the motherland and everything will be great.
I mean, that immediately reminded me of everything that Russia was doing and is doing in Georgia, the country where I was ambassador. It was exactly that kind of disinformation. Don't trust those Europeans and those Americans. They're not really going to come to your help. When push comes to shove, you're really better off with us. And that constant sort of effort to undermine. But the Taiwanese appear to be pretty resilient and pretty plucky. I mean, they've obviously looked and with great admiration at the Ukrainians and Zelensky and the posture that they have taken. I mean, the reality is that in the recent elections, the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, which probably takes the strongest line on China, got re-elected for the third time. You were there, so what motivated their decisions and, what's giving them that courage?
Well, as you say with Ukraine, I think that gives them sort of that a small nation can actually defend itself. Of course, right now the situation looks slightly more difficult in Ukraine, but I think the first 2 years showed that even with a much larger army, it is difficult, and it would be for the Chinese as well, even though on paper their army, navy, air force is so much larger than the Taiwanese. But invading an island is not easy. When you ask Taiwanese, I think most of them really desire the status quo, which is also why the Nationalist Party, that we should not at all rule out. I think that the fact that the DPP now won a third consecutive presidential run, but actually the Nationalist Party won the parliament and the majority there. And they seek closer cooperation with China. But I think it's in the long run, it's also still the same strategy for survival of Taiwan as it is, of saying, okay, if we, as one parliamentarian from KMT that I interviewed said to me, but we've made this through 70 years. If we can kick the can down the road and, of course, not annoy the Chinese that much so we are on the top of the leadership's radar, then maybe they'll not. So they're struggling with how do we basically keep the big dragon kind of away on our doorstep. Some of them are worried the other way around of saying, are we just going to be a pawn in a big power game between the US and China? So I would say it's a really lively Taiwanese political system, and they have all sorts of views and basically try to figure out the best way as a small country, small island, to survive in a really difficult region and world for them.
After the break, what are the risks of tensions across the Taiwan Straits actually escalating into a full-blown conflict? And what can we do to prevent that?
Do you ever feel like the world is on the brink? China, Russia, the Middle East, the USA, all flashpoints for violence and all interconnected. But how? Every Wednesday, This Is Not a Drill with me, Gavin Esler, dives into the danger gripping the globe and seeks answers, clarity and context from the very best geopolitical experts you need to hear from. That's This Is Not a Drill with me, Gavin Esler, every Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts.
So let's come to this risk of it actually turning into a full-blown conflict. I mean, what worries me about what you've written and what you've been saying and the logic of Xi's rhetoric is even if he doesn't intend there to be a full-blown war between China and Taiwan, he's kind of set the stage and the expectation that at some stage Taiwan should be assimilated back into China and that he is going to deliver that. So there's a risk of this sort of kind of momentum happening, even if he doesn't mean it. And my understanding is that certainly amongst US analysts, there has been this perspective. I don't know if she's actually explicitly said it or not. Perhaps you could clarify this, that apparently there is some deadline by 2027, that their military will be ready and that is their target date. But then more recently, she is apparently being quoted saying there's no specific time frame. What's your assessment?
I think both are true in the sense that it does come from US intelligence that have stated publicly that they have intelligence that she has ordered the military to be capability-wise ready for a Taiwan contingency, basically invasion by 2027, which is also why we've just seen again satellite images that floated around of a Chinese military base where they're basically training in what looks on satellite photos at least to be the sort of the presidential palace and the inner city of Taipei.
Yeah, they've done a sort of model, right? There's a sort of a model island, and so sort of showing the streets and the layout.
Exactly. So basically training very practically. So I think this is happening because the system has been put into motion. Then, of course, would that mean that she automatically in 2027 would push the button for an invasion? No, that would, of course, be his decision at that time, and it could happen later. I mean, the reason I think why some also put more emphasis on the year 2027 is because it's the year when Xi Jinping will have to be reappointed at the party congress by the party. And of course, if economic results are lacking at that time, this could be a sort of possibility then to launch into more sort of nationalistic adventures. Even though, of course, all of us hope, but I think hope is not a strategy now that we've seen what Putin did in Ukraine, that because the stakes here also economically are so much higher. Taiwan, which is little known, produces a huge part of the world's computer chips. And even just a Chinese blockade of Taiwan would lead to a major disruption of technological globalization and of our supply chains and of our economies. Bloomberg, just in connection with the election, had a scenario where they looked at it. I think their estimate was that this would be double what Corona sort of costed the world economy. There is that at stake. I think it now becomes our responsibility to much more clearly step in on deterrence when it comes to Taiwan. I look at where we've been relatively meek, also because most of our countries, the UK, Denmark, where I'm from, we follow the US as well. There's one China policy where we basically recognize that the People's Republic of China is the international representative. It doesn't mean, which China takes it to mean, that we've all recognized that Taiwan, by whatever means, is part of China. But it does, with a difference from Ukraine, which is a UN-ordained country. Taiwan does not have that status. It does mean that China also, on the legal kind of warfare, you could call it, is loading up in the UN, trying to sort of represent Taiwan and present it as a domestic matter, meaning that even if they used force, they would probably try at that time to get African allies and others of China of saying, oh, no, this is just a domestic matter and has nothing to do with the UN. So there is that aspect that's really hard for the Taiwanese and for the rest of us to deal with, and which is why I think we should be clearer in our messages of saying to Xi Jinping that, yes, this would be catastrophic for us as well. Yes, we're democracies. We don't like when our economies decline. But no, we don't like it when dictators attack neighboring countries either. We're willing to do roughly the same as we did with Russia, which is try to get our companies to sort of withdraw from China, well knowing that this would lead to a massive reduction in our own economies.
What about the geopolitical implications of a full-blown clash between China and Taiwan? Can you just sketch out that for us?
Well, those are also pretty dire. You could say this is probably the most likely spot for a great power confrontation. So meaning that you could have China militarily attack Taiwan, but you also have the US that has, at least under President Biden, 4 times has said that in the case of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, he would commit US military to defend Taiwan. So that would mean it would lead from there to sort of a great power clash, which is different from what we see with Ukraine, where of course we're all supporting, including military Ukraine, but it's the Ukrainians that are fighting. There could be that difference, and this is really the spot where you could see sort of that major clash militarily. This is also the big clash on values that you really have night and day in the Taiwan Strait, that you have an autocratic system on the one side, you have a system that's developed into a really well-functioning democracy, and it's actually that fascinating with Taiwan that they now sort of top some of the rankings, both when you look at Freedom House, when you look at the Economist Intelligence Unit. They're also the only or the first Asian country that has legalized same-sex marriage. So it's also a quite progressive society that they developed into. So it is really on values night and day. So if those 23 million, as they are, Taiwanese, were forced to be part of China, that would be a much less free world and be really, really sad. I think if Taiwan were to fall with either the US supporting them or the US not doing anything, it would have a huge repercussion for the US security alliances in the region. So that both Japan and Korea would probably both have a very quick debate about going nuclear in order to protect themselves against China.
So deterrence, trying to prevent this happening in the first place. What is Taiwan doing, and what do we need to do to support it? And are we on the right track?
The Taiwanese, of course, need to show that they want to defend themselves. I mean, that's the first basic point. I think that's what surprised all of us with the Ukrainians when Zelensky said, I don't need a ride, I need ammo, and the Americans had been offered to evacuate him, sort of, and basically had thought that Ukraine under him would fall after a couple of days with the Russian onslaught. So the Taiwanese are, to a large degree, doing that. They are re-upping their defense budget. They have quite a number of civilian defense initiatives as well, which I visited on the island, particularly because they're an island, meaning that they would not be able to, as Ukraine has been able to relocate refugees into neighboring countries. They would basically be Taiwanese internally displaced. So I went to sort of these training classes where people were training, including as families, of how would they organize, even though there was no cell coverage, and prepare sort of refugee rucksacks. So that's kind of, unfortunately, kind of very practical preparation. I think us Europeans, realistically, apart from small contribution from the British and French, there is nobody in Europe that has the capacity in neither the South China Sea nor the Taiwan Strait. But it's not what's going to make a difference between a clash between the two largest navies of the world, the Chinese and the American. So I think our main contribution is on the economic deterrent. And here I think we have a really important point as well, because we do have the Germans that have sort of this burgeoning still economic relationship with the Chinese of saying, but we're willing to sacrifice a lot, including of our economy, for the world order that we like, where dictators don't just eat up neighboring countries. So I think that's the thing we have to play with, and we have to use it quite proactively. Some of this can happen. And of course, we need that dialogue then internally as well with our business community of saying, and I think actually their German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock's done a pretty good job of going out saying, we knew we were wrong with the Russians. We knew, we know now, the sort of the reliance on Russian gas was a detour, and we should not do the same with China, which has already happened, that we're basically extremely dependent on China on rare earths, on processing of different kinds of minerals, and basically on the green transition that we all want to see achieved. That happens increasingly on Chinese terms. So there's a lot there to look through as well of how do we, as Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the commission, has called it, de-risk our economic relationships with China. And this is not easy, but we should of course think about how we diversify each and every day so that we are not completely reliant on China in certain completely critical components.
So that's what should happen. But we've already seen in policy on Ukraine that sort of US domestic political dysfunction is beginning to hold up the delivery of essential military aid to Ukraine. And actually that Ukraine aid package is also, part of that is also a package of aid, not just to Israel, but to Taiwan as well. So that's all been held up by US political dysfunction. And then in Europe, you do have a number of populist leaders who have certainly displayed a certain amount of sympathy for Putin. So in practice, how easy do you think it will be to get that political will really to face down China and deliver those tough messages and follow through?
No, it would be hard. But I think we have to wake up to this new world order that Putin and Xi are trying to shape, and basically do our best to counter that. The autocrats don't have to win. We can actually do things to counter that, and we do have freedom movements around the world. We do have Chinese dissidents that want a different system. We do have Chinese that are fascinated by the way Taiwan works. So it's not that these things are completely inevitable, but on the other hand, if the US is going to abdicate as the world's policeman now, it's in a critical moment. It will be extremely hard. And Europe, when it comes to Ukraine, will have to step up immediately. And if it's in Asia, Asian allies will have to refocus completely, which is why I earlier mentioned the possibility of both Japan and South Korea could at some point want to develop their own nuclear capacity, basically to defend themselves against China if they see the US withdrawing.
Jonas, this has been a masterclass. There's so much substance in what we've covered, and we've really only scratched the surface of all the other issues in which China is affecting our world order. Do you have any last parting thoughts before we end this interview?
I think the optimism that when you talk about these topics, and maybe that's comparable to climate change, that some people then sort of fall completely into despair. And when I did a public presentation here recently, I had a young woman said, wait, so before I'm 50, there will be a major war in the Taiwan Strait. It will involve the two great powers, and it will kind of clash our world as we know it. And I said, this is also possible that we can change this. And things do happen. I mean, we have in our lifetime, when we were very young, experienced the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this was something that people didn't expect at all. But we do also know that we have to work really hard for it, in the same way that if we're going to revert climate change, it does demand governments, businesses, individuals to take action. So in the same way, to preserve liberty and secure a world with fewer dictators towards 2050, it will take a lot of determined action.
Well, thank you, Jonas. That allows us to close out this episode on a relatively optimistic note. Taiwan is perhaps the world's most fraught geopolitical hotspot, but we should not assume we're predestined to face catastrophe there. It is within our power to avoid conflict if we can muster the necessary resolve and determination. In fact, I'd like to end by quoting a US Congressman, Seth Moulton, who I heard say last year, quote, "Every day we want President Xi to wake up, look at what is happening in Ukraine and think, not today." And that's exactly why what's happening in Ukraine matters so much. It's not just about the security of Europe, it's about the message it sends to authoritarian leaders around the world. So that's it for this week. If you too want to help order the disorder, you could tap follow right now and you'll be notified when every episode launches. We're also on social media. Just search Disorder Show. And please do send us your questions. Jason and I love to hear from you, and we'll be responding to your questions in an upcoming episode. Our email address is disordershow@gmail.com. Finally, you can read more about today's topic by subscribing to our Substack. The link is in the show notes. All that remains is for me to thank our producer, George McDonough, our executive producer, Neil Fern, and you for listening. Thank you so much, and I hope you have an orderly week.
Do you ever feel like the world is on the brink? China, Russia, the Middle East, the USA, all flashpoints for violence and all interconnected. But how? Every Wednesday, This Is Not a Drill with me, Gavin Esler, dives into the danger gripping the globe and seeks answers, clarity and context from the very best geopolitical experts you need to hear from. That's This Is Not a Drill with me, Gavin Esler, every Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts.